I'm going to turn on the recording. Let's take a moment to drop into the resonance of all of us connected to Pachamama, to all the beings that Tara has just called in to be part of this circle, this sharing, this deepening and learning. Just taking a moment to feel us also connected to all the other groups all around the planet that come together to hold a space for healing and wholeness. And just to notice where in your body you arrive to a sense of connection and to whatever sense of steadiness you may have available right now. Just as we find ourselves in this space that has opened to a larger sense of connection. So that we and so many people around the planet right now are holding an intention and space for healing and wholeness. So just as we go along, notice the resonating tone of your presence and our presence as we are here together. So it's great to see everybody, and I have a couple of things to share this morning that touch on what's happening in the world right now, what our collective is going through. One of the things I've been delving into more deeply, as I've mentioned time and again, are the quantum realities that are part of the much bigger world that we aren't necessarily aware of, given how we're taught to experience reality in a linear, concrete kind of way. So wanted to talk first about the fact that there seems to be a constant intersection between intentions that we carry at a deep felt sense level, the intentions that really are alive for us, between that dynamic on our part and the quantum foam or the quantum realm of probabilities. And one of the things I've been thinking about in the current situation, and for those of you who are open to astrology, I'd like to share some of the astrological input that I've run into lately, because it's pretty interesting in terms of what we're going through. But I keep, and I said this many times, I keep wondering about orienting to the probability that represents the alternate reality or the possibility where a healed humanity is living on this planet. One of the things I'm very clear about is I don't know how to envision that. My thinking is too conditioned to what we already know about that I realize I can't grasp at a conscious level what that would look like. But I do feel that there is a probability that represents our presence on this planet as a healed humanity, or at least healed into a humanity that can live with difference and diversity and honor the larger context that we are of this planet, which we seem to forget. You know, our species so often, other than indigenous people who've never forgotten, we Westerners tend to think we're living on the planet. We forget that we are nature, we are of the planet. And so when I imagine drawing on an optimal humanity, I imagine a humanity that recognizes we are we are not separate from anything, but we're certainly not separate from the planet. It's not just a place we plopped ourselves as we live. So I just want to kind of hold that quantum idea that it's not about figuring out, I think, what's going to be better. It's about being open to being impressed and inspired by what the possibilities are that we aren't yet living. Because I'm aware that even with indigenous cultures, there have always been wars and conflict. It's still humanity not yet quite being able to move beyond our natural tribal tendency. So I don't know, I don't have anything to say that would qualify what that's like, but just to be calling on the optimal human expression on this planet and calling on it from the quantum realities of either probabilities or alternate realities. And that's where I've been going lately, because I think there are many people certainly holding the space that things can get better. And when we go through the astrological stuff, it's actually dicey in the moment, but better over the long run, depending on how we live into these possibilities. The other thing, excuse me, that's really important right now, especially between now and the 20th, one of the astrological predictions that I saw last week, and I was thinking, oh boy, was, I forget which planets were doing what, but the 6th was the worst day of this particular configuration. And it's getting better, but it's going to continue to be in effect through January 20th, which I just think is really interesting synchronistically, how those dates would be matching up with the astrological forecasts. But because of that, it seems to me more important than ever for each of us to become, what's the word I want to use? Really focused on coming back to steadiness all the time, like generating a steady field that can add to the other steady people on the planet and feed that into the collective. That the astrological configurations are about unsteadiness. So I think that just for us to keep coming back again and again, because I really never underscored the power of how much we are affected by our collective environment. You know, just like we know that breathing toxic air isn't good for us, what to resonate with within our collective human consciousness. I've been listening to a couple of books lately by a woman whose name I'm going to have to look up. It might be Penny Pierce. They're all about frequencies and resonances. And it's just a very deep reminder about how important it is to be conscious and choiceful about what frequencies we're focused on and what frequencies we're resonating with. I had a client this week on Thursday morning cancel his session because he was too enraged. And I thought, gee, seems to me this would be the time where you'd want your session to get back into steadiness. But when someone sends you a text before they go to bed at night, there wasn't much I could do the next morning. But I think that that's not the choice we want to be making. I think it's really important to keep coming back to the choice of, where do I find my steadiness? And, you know, a nag that I have been, also coming back to the idea of universal love and just imagining that raining down on the planet, touching everyone as a frequency to offer. So let me do a little of this astrology stuff. There's also some stuff from David that I want to share. Astrologically, for those of you who follow astrology or are even interested, we are moving now into the age of Aquarius. And that's going to create a lot of change in this transitional time from a more authoritarian, patriarchally, hierarchically oriented Pisces into Aquarius, which is more group oriented. It'll be more community oriented. I think under Aquarius, people talk about leadership being a shared group activity more than just having a person who's in control. And in fact, this woman I want to talk a little about, and Tulasi, thank you so much for sending Pam Gregory's link. She's really interesting. She emphasizes community, bringing things back to also more local, working together and setting things up in a way that takes care of the community. So there is a theme of awakening, she says, in 2021, and points out how that isn't always an easy journey. And we've talked before about how the old crystallized structures need to be broken down so that what's new can arise. And that's apparently what this next phase, probably the next couple of years, but this next phase for sure is the breaking down of the old. She said, under Capricorn, you want to ask yourself, how well have we mastered our emotions? And I think for me, that takes me back to where are we focusing our attention and what frequencies are we resonating with? And if we could all kind of take it on just as a practice during this time, so that when there's bad news or there's something that's upsetting and distressing, not to overlook that, but to let that be the call to come back into being a steady container for whatever those feelings are, so you can fully experience them, but they're within the container of steadiness. So like from an SE perspective, we're riding the distress rather than being escalated by it. She said, so Pam says this is a good time to set intentions. And for me, for setting intentions for our individual life and for our collective, and that's where I go back to the quantum possibility of an optimal human family. She said, this is a time to shift to higher frequencies based on unconditional love. I think it's because unconditional love just is a fundamentally healing frequency. Now, the practice that I have found challenging, but I have made myself do it regularly, is to keep my heart open to everybody, to the best of my ability. And, this is a really hard practice, to not make us and them, to not go into an othering, but to come back and be able to disagree vehemently without making an other. It's a very hard, to me, the mind can't do it. It has to be the heart brain that's able to say, what you're doing is absolutely appalling, and I recognize that you are still of the same one that I am, that you're not something other that should be destroyed or eliminated. So to me, that it's a very big practice requiring conscious awareness and choice. This goes back to choice and frequency. Can't speak about frequency in this time. It's really important where we resonate. Interestingly enough, Pam Gregory mentioned the word sovereignty. And I thought I was immediately thinking of David, and she was talking about cultivating a sense of sovereignty and our own sense of power, not in a way that is okay, now I don't care about anybody else, but that is an empowered presence. And that matches very much with what David Spangler always says about any of his spiritual work, that we need to start it from that place of awareness of our own presence as we move into anything we might be doing, just so that our note, the sound we emanate is very clear as we engage other dynamics. And I'll have something to say about that in a minute, about what he says about interacting with the subtle realms and the importance of what frequency we're resonating with when we interact with the subtle realms. Pam sees the first half of the year as being chaotic in the sense of breaking down old structures. That top-down control will be eroded if the top doesn't keep a certain integrity. Because again, in Aquarius, what has meaning is the whole group, the whole community. She said, we're moving into a very different phase that is quite fast moving, with disclosures, old things breaking down, and she considers it a really exciting time of change and innovation. Fixed views will clash. And she says, with the polarities being pronounced, you want to ask yourself if that's where you want to live, or if you want to put your awareness on unity consciousness. And I actually think when we resonate with oneness, as that goes into the collective, you know how many times I've talked about the things we're resonating into the collective can just become the foundation under which people who are wobbling might be able to stand. That our resonating with the reality of oneness can just become that leg up someone might need to pop into a more unity level consciousness. So I find that not only does it benefit me when I resonate with all this, but I do consider that a very active form of subtle activism, that we are really doing something when we're resonating with certain frequencies. So just from a cosmological point of view, and I won't go into this because I didn't really understand it, but in what Pam has to say is the Earth is also involved in a cosmological shift, where the Earth itself is now coming more online, whatever that means. I have no idea what it means, but she says we're entering a whole new world, a new Earth, and we're helping to create these new conditions that are going to make this next phase possible. She says, keep your frequencies high because we're moving into a more ethereal age. Aquarius is an air sign, or at least it supports air sign, where everything is energy. Now, this certainly matches what David's been teaching about being more aware of how many frequencies and dimensions there are once we're more attuned to energy, rather than just this material world. She said things settle down by March and especially by May, which is very nice to think about. And one of the things I've been talking about a lot lately, and I seem to be on a rant about it when I post on Facebook or whatever, is to challenge our human-centric beliefs about who and what we are in this world. And I know I've been writing a lot and using the term earthkin, because I really don't want people to think of anything on this planet as anything but our relative, as another expression of the oneness. So we are all earthkin. And I will send out at one point, I think I talked about this last month, this book I read about experiments that humans do on animals, and how when you deconstruct the experiments that we have put together and you realize how human-centric they are, that they can't measure animal intelligence until they're retooled to do it the way animals do it. And I may have told you about one of the experiments. You know how there is this theory in human science that only animals who can recognize themselves in a mirror are self-aware. So they were taking elephants, and they put a dot on the elephant's head so that when they look in the mirror, they're going to rub it off. Well, elephants never rubbed anything off, and the conclusion was, well, see, they don't have self-awareness. And a young researcher came along, and she said, hey folks, what would happen if you made an elephant-sized mirror? Why don't you try that and then see what happens, right? So the minute they had an elephant-sized mirror, they were like madly rubbing their foreheads. Another experiment they did was with gibbons, and they gave them some kind of motor experiment, and they said, those gibbons, they're not as smart as other primates. They can't do this task. And again, it was a young researcher said, have you noticed that the experiment is made based on how human hands operate? Why don't you watch the gibbon hands and see what happens if you make the experiment for gibbon hands? Well, then of course they could do them. So it's this need to step out of our assumption that we are somehow at the top of this pyramid of evolving intelligence. Oh, and another thing, if you're interested in it, it's a bit of a thick article, but this article came my way that said, your brain is not what you think it is. You know how in SE especially, we've been teaching always limbic, and then evolved into mammalian, and then evolved into cortical. And it's just not right. There are pictures of shark brains, bird brains, and human brains. They all have the same parts. They're just in different sizes and correlations to each other. So we've just been so wedded to this idea that we are the progress that evolution has made, and that's just not the real story. So I'm thinking in terms of this new way of being in the world, we've got to break down this idea that we somehow are up there on the top of a pyramid to get us back down into the oneness of the circle that we're actually in. So those are a couple of other things. And then let me just share some of what David offered about when he was working with his teacher, John. John did something to him I think I would have just freaked me out no end, but David knew it was only temporary, so it didn't freak him out. John wanted him to understand the difference between energy and subtle awareness. So he blocked David's subtle awareness for about a week. And David said it was like losing a limb. He couldn't, but he wasn't terrified because he knew it was going to be over soon. But he had to then really notice his energy and his who he was without all this subtle awareness. And so he said now, as he thinks about the subtle realms, he was talking about what he had learned about the need to be steady when interacting with the subtle realms, because what they had told him was, if you are jangled or what we would call activated, they can't register us as easily as they can if we're steady. So David said that the metaphor he's used for himself is like a lake. And on a moonlit night, if the lake is calm, you can see the moon really well. If there's a storm going on it, you're not going to see a clear reflection. So he says, when our thoughts and feelings are tightly focused on our everyday concerns, our subtle energy takes on that wavelength. And then that's kind of like the lake with all the disturbance. He said, when we turn our attention, thoughts, and feelings toward the spiritual and subtle realms, toward our allies, toward the beings we want to collaborate with, we generate a wavelength, particularly if love is involved, that is much more accessible to them, so that the contact and the communication will be much more accessible. And do you notice here he comes back to love also? Pam's talking about love, David's talking about love. I think it's just really important to cultivate whatever your relationship with the frequency of love feels like, what that is for you. And I would add to that the importance of going into your heart brain. Perceiving with the heart automatically orients you to a more likely love-oriented frequency. And so these practices feel more and more important everywhere I keep running into them, no matter what I'm reading about. He says about the distinction between light. Now, this is not energy, but light, capital L, light and subtle energies. And this resonated for me. Light is an expression of the one, the embracing life that lives us. And subtle energies, on the other hand, are the result of living activity. They are generated by beings who, compared to this infinite one, are finite and possessing a bounded identity to some nature. The way I've always thought about this, and I've probably mentioned this any number of times, for me, oddly, the void is where the light of the one is found, because the void is the arena of infinite possibility. From that moves all manifestation. And for me, that's then what becomes the subtle realms. Everything that moves into manifestation is now embodied in some frequency and engaged in some kind of expression or life. So this morning, I was going back to a way of attuning that I used to use all the time, and I want to go back to it again, is, you know, we've been talking about the light of wholeness, the light that emanates from the body, the mind, the emotions, the subtle body, your spiritual source. That's the light, that's a light, that's not the light, capital L. But then the light, capital L, I've always experienced as a spark. I don't know how else to describe it. It's like a little pilot light, but a spark. And when I was a little kid, I used to think, why can't I just reach in and touch that and then somebody's healed? You know, just as a little kid, I'd be thinking about reaching in and finding this spark and just touching it, and that would change something. But now as a grown up, and I come back to it, I think it, excuse me, for me, it represents the same source that's in everything, that everything has a spark that is the life living it, or the source. And then from there comes the light of wholeness, all the things we see in the subtle realm, all the whole array of distinctions then come from that spark. So I was going back this morning to resonating with that, as well as the light of wholeness, but being very aware of the distinction that we are an expression in the world, but we are this spark. Maybe Nancy isn't this spark, but the life living me is. I don't even know. These things now elude me. I can't understand them at all, but I feel that spark. So I want to just invite you all to be aware that inherent in you is, however you envision it, is this spark of life that is the capital L life and light. And then there is, in addition to that, the radiating light of your wholeness. And I think the radiating light of our wholeness, why I'm so committed to that now, just has a huge impact on the world around us, on your environment that you live in. That light touches everything. And remember, David is constantly saying that which we are aware of, we heighten. So if I'm aware that the light of wholeness in me is resonating with the light of wholeness in everything around me, I'm heightening our excuse me, boy, cat allergies are rampant right at the moment. That light heightens the living presence of the whole space and everything in it. This was really moving. I liked this from David. He said, you don't incarnate into a body, you incarnate into a system. And David said, these days, I would say we incarnate as a system, that we're just part of the whole thing. Another thing David said somewhere, and I can't find it, it's in one of the things I was reading, that when we make a distinction between who's here in this realm and the soul, he said, no, your soul is incarnated into this realm as you, that there's no break between who we are here and who we are with whatever a soul even means, which I also don't know anymore, but that there is a through line, because that spiritual essence is the incarnation of us. It confuses me, and I'm sorry if I'm confusing you. I'm just throwing it out there because it feels important to remember we are spirit and form. Everything here is spirit and form. There's no break between spirit and matter. It's all one piece. It's just different frequencies of one piece, of one continuous whole. So just my closing thought about this in David's stuff is just how he's pointing out that we are here as part of a time and place. And just to be kind of keenly aware of being incarnated into a context, then how do we hold that? And what intentions do we bring to it? And what frequencies do we offer to the context in which we are incarnated? And that includes not just the human context, but the nature around us, all the other life forms. How do we relate? I think from everything I've read this month, the key piece is, again, as it always is, but it's so emphasized, is the importance of the frequencies with which we resonate. And it seems that with the coming in of Aquarius, the pace is increasing. And since Pam was saying, the things are much more energetically in awareness, more important than ever to be aware of what we're emanating and where we're resonating, not only for our own good, but for the good of the context in which we are inescapably part. That we're never, what I like about this is that we all know this and none of us believe any differently, but it's just nice to have a validation of how much we can never be separate from the context within which we live, that we are just never individual, unique, separate beings at all. So I just want to have that be something that we're aware of as we also think about how do we return to and radiate steadiness into our context, along with love and our presence. So let me stop the record.